Alexander Ericson thought his life was perfect, a loving wife, 2 kids, and a peaceful small-town existence. But when a seemingly innocent supermarket receipt shattered that illusion, his world spiraled into a devastating truth. What happens when you discover your partner's betrayal, and how far would you go to uncover the full story? This is the journey of Alexander's heartbreak, revenge, and ultimate redemption. Alexander Ericson, a 43-year-old Scandinavian architect, had built what many would call a perfect life. He was a man who seemed to have it all: a successful career, a beautiful home nestled in the outskirts of their quiet Scandinavian town, and a family that was the envy of those around them. His wife, Lisa, a dedicated primary school teacher, was the heart of their home. Together they had 2 children, Emma, 10, and Henrik, 7, both full of energy and life, completing the picture of a wholesome, happy family. Every evening, after a long day of designing buildings and overseeing projects, Alexander would come home to the familiar sound of his children's laughter and the smell of dinner cooking in the kitchen. Lisa, with her warm smile, would greet him, asking about his day, and they would settle in for their nightly routine. Life seemed predictable in the best way. There was never any drama, no unspoken tension. Their marriage felt solid, built on mutual respect and deep love. Alexander trusted his wife completely, and he had no reason to believe that anything could disrupt the peaceful existence they had created. But even the most serene of lives can be shaken by the smallest ripple. It started with something so seemingly innocent that Alexander didn't give it a second thought at first. One day, while sorting through the mail, he came across a receipt from a supermarket in a nearby town. It wasn't unusual for Lisa to run errands, but the receipt was dated for a time during the workday when Lisa should have been at school. Alexander's heart sank. It was a small detail, but it lingered in his mind, unsettling him in ways he couldn't fully explain. It wasn't just the receipt itself, but the nagging feeling that followed. He couldn't remember Lisa mentioning the trip or the supermarket. The suspicion grew slowly, like a slow burn he couldn't put out. The more he thought about it, the more questions began to rise. Why had she been there? Why hadn't she told him? Could this be the first sign that things were not as perfect as they seemed? Alexander pushed the thought aside at first, telling himself it was probably nothing. He trusted Lisa, but as days went by, that one small, seemingly insignificant moment continued to gnaw at him. What if this was the beginning of something much bigger? He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, and as he lay awake at night, the thought of his perfect life being shattered by a hidden truth grew more and more unbearable. He had to know. He couldn't rest until he uncovered the reality of what was going on. But the deeper he dug, the more dangerous the search for answers would become. It wasn't long after the supermarket receipt incident that Alexander's suspicions started to spiral out of control. He began to notice small details, things he had never paid attention to before. Lisa's routine, once so reliable, had changed ever so slightly. There were unexplained absences, late nights that didn't add up, and moments where she seemed distant, distracted, almost like she was keeping something from him. At first, Alexander chalked it up to the pressures of work or the stress that comes with raising 2 children. Lisa was a teacher after all. Her job was demanding, and balancing work with family life could sometimes feel overwhelming. But as the days went by, those excuses began to feel hollow. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about late work nights or stress. It was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. His mind became a whirlwind of doubt. He found himself thinking about her every move, her every word. Why had she been so vague about her schedule lately? Why had she suddenly become more secretive with her phone, taking it with her into the other room whenever he entered? Alexander wasn't one to jump to conclusions. He was rational, level-headed, but the small, seemingly insignificant changes in Lisa's behavior began to form a pattern, and that pattern didn't sit right with him. He even started keeping track of her whereabouts more carefully. On one particular afternoon, he remembered her mentioning a staff meeting at school. But when he asked her about it later, her answer was strangely non-specific. She didn't seem to want to elaborate on the details. His gut instinct told him something was off. This wasn't just about a late meeting or an innocent errand. There was something more at play, and Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to be turned upside down. Despite all of these warning signs, Alexander still couldn't bring himself to directly confront Lisa. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the truth, or if he even wanted to. But the deeper he dug into his own suspicions, the more he realized that his perfect life might be built on a foundation of lies. Each day that passed, the truth seemed further out of reach, yet he couldn't stop the feeling that it was just waiting to be uncovered. Alexander's suspicions had been eating away at him, but it wasn't until he found something more concrete that his world truly began to unravel. It started innocently enough. Lisa had left her phone unattended on the kitchen counter one evening. Alexander, though he had never been the type to snoop, couldn't help but feel compelled to take a quick glance. His heart raced as he unlocked the phone, the display lighting up with a message notification from someone named Douglas. At first, he thought it was a business contact, but when he opened the message, the words were anything but professional. "I can't wait to see you tonight," the text read, and then another one. "How about a quiet dinner at the usual place? I miss you." The breath caught in Alexander's chest. His mind raced as he stared at the phone, replaying the subtle signs that had troubled him over the past few weeks. This was no innocent business relationship. This was an affair, an emotional betrayal wrapped in the warmth of a secret love affair. Alexander's heart sank. The images of their life together, the family, the trust, everything he thought he knew about Lisa, was now shattered by this single revelation. He quickly deleted the messages, trying to calm himself before Lisa returned. But the damage was done. The proof was undeniable. His wife, the woman he had shared everything with, had been lying to him. And it wasn't just a one-time fling or a mistake. It was a relationship, a deep connection with someone else. His mind spun as he replayed the messages in his head. Who was Douglas? Why had Lisa kept this from him? And most importantly, how could she betray him like this? Later that evening, when Lisa returned home, Alexander was numb. He couldn't bear to look at her the same way again. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt cold and foreign. He needed answers. He had to know everything. His perfect life had been exposed for the lie it was, and the truth was now inescapable. The next few days passed in a blur of silence. Alexander couldn't look at Lisa without feeling a heavy weight in his chest. Each time she spoke to him, he heard only the echo of the betrayal in her voice. The small, seemingly insignificant moments they once shared felt like distant memories, overshadowed by the ugly truth that hung between them. It wasn't just the affair. It was the deceit, the secret life she had been living right under his nose. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Alexander finally decided he could no longer live with the crushing weight of silence. He confronted Lisa in their living room, where they had shared so many conversations in the past. The walls, once filled with warmth, now felt like they were closing in on him. "Lisa, I know about Douglas," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, though the pain burned in his chest. Lisa froze. Her face went pale as she looked at him, and for a moment, Alexander thought she might deny it. But then, with a deep sigh, she lowered her gaze. She knew this day would come. "I'm sorry, Alexander," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. It meant nothing." But Alexander couldn't hold back the flood of emotion that overwhelmed him. "A mistake?" A moment of weakness? He repeated bitterly. You've been seeing him for months, Lisa. How long were you going to keep this secret from me? Lisa tried to explain, but Alexander wasn't listening anymore. The words spilled out of her mouth, but they all felt hollow, empty. I didn't want to hurt you, she said. It didn't mean anything. I thought I could just forget about it. It was just a fling. A fling? Alexander's voice cracked. It's not just a fling, Lisa. It's a betrayal. And you've been lying to me, to our family, for months. You didn't think this would hurt me? Lisa's eyes filled with tears, but Alexander couldn't bring himself to comfort her. The damage had been done. His trust had been shattered, and no amount of apologies could fix that. I can't do this anymore, Lisa, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm done. In that moment, the decision was final. The life they had built together, the family, the trust, everything came crashing down. It was over. In the weeks that followed, the once harmonious family life was replaced by the painful process of separation. Alexander filed for divorce, and as much as he tried to focus on the logistics of the split, his heart ached with every decision that had to be made. The house, the children, everything he had fought for, all of it seemed to be slipping through his fingers. But even as the pain overwhelmed him, Alexander knew he couldn't stay in a marriage built on lies. Lisa, for her part, was devastated by the divorce. The small town where they lived made the news of her infidelity inevitable. Whispers spread quickly, and people who had once been close friends began to avoid her. The reality of her actions set in as she faced the judgment of the very community she had once been an integral part of. Her reputation, which had once been pristine, was now tarnished beyond repair. As for Douglas, the man she had betrayed her family for, he was nowhere to be found. Alexander tried to track him down, but Douglas seemed to have vanished, leaving Lisa to deal with the fallout alone. The affair had been a fleeting moment in Lisa's life, but the consequences were far-reaching. In the midst of this chaos, Alexander focused on rebuilding his own life. His children, though deeply affected by the divorce, became his top priority. They were his anchor, and he poured all his energy into being the best father he could be for them. He found solace in time spent with them, and slowly, he started to rediscover the person he had once been before the betrayal had consumed him. Lisa, on the other hand, struggled. She had thought that finding a new partner would ease the pain of the divorce, but her infidelity had left scars that no one could easily heal. She found herself in a lonely world, facing the reality of her choices. The men she met after the divorce weren't interested in someone with the baggage of a broken marriage and a tarnished reputation. No matter how hard she tried to move on, she couldn't escape the consequences of her actions. As the divorce proceedings dragged on, the ripple effects of Alexander and Lisa's shattered marriage began to spread through their small town. It wasn't just Alexander and Lisa who were left picking up the pieces. There was also Anna, Lisa's best friend, whose own marriage was unraveling in parallel. Anna had been Lisa's confidant throughout the affair, listening to her friend's every regret and rationalizing her actions. They had often shared moments of vulnerability, laughing over wine while discussing their marital struggles. But Anna had no idea that her own marriage was about to suffer the same fate. In her heart, Anna had always known there was something off in her relationship with Robin, her husband of 12 years. But she never imagined the truth would come crashing down like this. It wasn't until Robin discovered Anna's involvement in the affair that the storm truly hit. The way he found out was nothing short of cruel fate. He came across a string of text messages between Anna and Lisa, including the same kind of flirtatious and intimate exchanges that had sent Alexander into a spiral. The texts were a brutal reminder of how deep the betrayal went. When Robin confronted Anna, there was no turning back. He was devastated, not only by Anna's betrayal, but also by the realization that their entire relationship had been built on a foundation of dishonesty. The walls that had once kept their love intact began to crumble. Robin, unable to forgive her, packed his things and left. It was a gut-wrenching moment, one that Anna had feared but never anticipated with such intensity. She was now not only facing the destruction of her marriage, but the collapse of her own self-esteem. The thought of losing Robin, the father of their 2 children, felt unbearable. But just like Lisa, Anna was left with the consequences of her own choices. While Lisa struggled to regain any semblance of stability after her divorce, Anna found herself facing the fallout in a more personal and direct way. She had lost her best friend, and now her marriage, leaving her to grapple with an overwhelming sense of loneliness. It seemed that every part of her life that had once felt secure was now upended. Friends avoided her, and she was left to face the judgment of the very community she had once felt a part of. The whispers about her affair with Lisa's husband were relentless, and as much as she tried to move forward, the weight of her actions hung heavy over her every interaction. For Lisa and Anna, the consequences of their infidelity were far more than just broken relationships. They were societal scars, marking them as women who had betrayed their families and betrayed the very trust they had once held sacred. No amount of time could erase the stigma they now carried, and they both had to learn the painful truth. Some mistakes are impossible to undo. As Lisa and Anna grappled with the consequences of their actions, Alexander began the painful but necessary process of rebuilding his life. At first, everything felt like a blur. The divorce, the emotional wreckage, the thoughts of how everything had once seemed perfect. His life had been shattered, but he wasn't about to let that define him forever. For the sake of his children, he had to move forward. His initial days alone were filled with uncertainty. He hadn't lived alone in over a decade, and the silence of the house felt suffocating at times. The laughter and chaos of his children, Emma and Henrik, had always been the soundtrack of his life. But now, even their presence couldn't completely fill the void that had opened up. Alexander would often find himself staring out of the window, lost in his thoughts, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. But slowly, with each passing day, Alexander began to heal. The first step was in embracing his role as a father. He poured everything he had into being there for Emma and Henrik. They were his priority now, and he knew he had to remain strong for them. He organized outings, spent time helping them with school projects, and took them to the places they loved, building new memories together. His children became his anchor, a reminder of the family he still had, even if it was different than before. Eventually, Alexander began to think about his future, his own happiness, and what he truly wanted from life. As time passed, he crossed paths with someone new, Elise, a woman who had also gone through a painful betrayal. Elise was a kind-hearted woman in her late 30s, a counselor who had once been married to a man who had cheated on her. She had her own scars from the past, but like Alexander, she was determined to move forward, to find happiness again. Their connection wasn't instant, but as they spent more time together, they found comfort in each other's company. Elise understood the complexities of betrayal, and for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt like he wasn't alone in his pain. Together, they helped each other heal, sharing stories of their past struggles and how they were learning to navigate a new chapter in their lives. For Alexander, the journey wasn't about forgetting Lisa or erasing the past. It was about learning to live with the scars and understanding that sometimes life doesn't turn out as planned. He had the strength to rebuild, to forge a path forward, and to find peace once again. He had found someone who understood his pain, someone who was ready to build a future together, one step at a time. As Alexander stood in his new life, surrounded by the love of his children and the warmth of a new relationship, he realized that though the past could never be erased, the future was still his to create. and in that, he found a sense of peace he never thought he would have again. As time passed, Alexander's life began to slowly regain a sense of normalcy. But it was a new kind of normal. The pain of his marriage falling apart was still raw, but he had learned something important during the hardest days. He had to rebuild not just his family life, but himself as well. At first, it felt like the weight of the world was constantly pressing down on him. He hadn't realized how much he had neglected his own needs while trying to keep the family together. In the aftermath of the divorce, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about love and trust. The emotional toll had left him mentally exhausted, and for a while he wondered if he would ever feel the same way again. But gradually, with the support of his children, friends, and new relationships, Alexander began to pick up the pieces of his broken heart. Therapy became an important part of his healing. He had never been the type of man to open up about his feelings, especially not to strangers. But after hearing from a close friend about how much therapy had helped him during tough times, Alexander decided to give it a try. The first few sessions were difficult. He struggled to articulate his emotions, constantly feeling like he was swimming in a sea of confusion and anger. But over time, he started to uncover the deep hurt that he had buried for so long. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt him, but the years of denial, the unspoken frustrations, and the emotional exhaustion of trying to fix a relationship that was no longer healthy. As Alexander worked through his pain, he started to regain his confidence. He rediscovered old hobbies, spent more time outdoors, and focused on his work, throwing himself into projects that had once been put on hold. He found solace in the simple things, taking long walks, having conversations with friends, and spending time with his children. And most importantly, he learned to forgive himself. He no longer blamed himself for Lisa's choices. He realized that no matter how much he had loved her, he couldn't control her actions. In the end, Alexander transformed. He was no longer the man who had silently endured the betrayal, but a man who had found his voice, his strength, and his peace. Though the scars of the past remained, they no longer defined him. His life was moving forward, and he was ready to embrace whatever came next. While Alexander was slowly finding his way forward, Lisa was left in the aftermath of the divorce to face the harsh reality of the consequences of her actions. She had thought that leaving Alexander would be the end of her problems, but in truth, it was only the beginning. The small town they lived in didn't make it easy for her. Gossip spread quickly, and everywhere she went, she could feel the judgment in the air. Friends who had once been close now avoided her, and even strangers gave her cold stares. The shame of her affair was something she couldn't escape. Her once perfect life was now a far cry from the ideal she had imagined, and the weight of her choices pressed down on her every day. Lisa had hoped that, after the divorce, she could quickly find a new relationship. But things weren't as easy as she had imagined. Men who once found her attractive now viewed her through a different lens. They saw the broken woman, the one who had betrayed her family and lost her marriage. The love she had hoped to find in another person was elusive. Every new date, every new attempt at moving on ended in disappointment. She had never felt more isolated. The realization that she had not only lost her husband, but also the respect of the people around her, hit Lisa hard. It was as though the world had turned its back on her, and there was no way to reverse the damage. She tried to fill the emptiness with superficial relationships and distractions, but nothing seemed to fill the void inside her. Her attempts at dating were met with a cold reception, and she began to wonder if she would ever be able to trust anyone again, let alone find a man who would accept her with all her baggage. It wasn't just the romantic side of her life that struggled. Her relationship with her children also began to suffer. They were old enough to understand that something had changed in their family, and their growing distance from Lisa only intensified the guilt she felt. No matter how hard she tried to patch things up, the emotional distance was too great. Her actions had set a chain of events in motion that she couldn't undo, and the consequences were far-reaching. Lisa began to face the truth that she would have to work harder than she ever had to rebuild her life and her sense of self-worth. The path forward was unclear, and the loneliness she felt was suffocating. But she had no choice but to try and put the pieces of her life together, even if it meant starting from scratch. As the months turned into years, Alexander and Lisa's lives continued to diverge. For Alexander, the journey was one of healing, growth, and ultimately finding a new love. Elise, the woman who had crossed his path during his healing process, proved to be a catalyst for a fresh start. She wasn't looking to replace his past. Rather, she was there to help him build a new future, a future where trust, understanding, and support could be the cornerstones of a new relationship. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Elise understood his scars, and she didn't push him to forget his past, but rather encouraged him to learn from it. She showed him that forgiveness wasn't about absolution, but about freeing himself from the weight of anger and resentment. Over time, Alexander learned that forgiveness was not just a gift to others, but a necessary step in healing himself. Lisa, on the other hand, found herself in a constant struggle with her own demons. Despite her efforts to find peace, her past actions haunted her. But even as she grappled with her guilt, Lisa began to realize that forgiveness wasn't just for Alexander, it was for her too. The road to redemption was long, but she knew that in order to move on, she had to forgive herself for her mistakes. It wasn't easy, and the journey was filled with setbacks, but Lisa learned that growth wasn't a straight line. She had to rebuild trust in herself before she could hope to regain trust from anyone else. For both of them, the road ahead was uncertain. But they had each learned valuable lessons about the fragility of trust, the importance of self-awareness, and the power of forgiveness. They were no longer the same people they had been at the start of their tumultuous journey, but they had emerged stronger, more resilient, and ready to face whatever came next. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more engaging content. Your support means the world.